This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Andrea Knabel was last seen in this neighborhood in the Audubon Park area.
A community is shocked when mother of two, Andrea Knabel, vanishes into thin air.
We did multiple interviews. We have developed some pretty good leads.
But cryptic clues and a murky timeline leave little evidence behind.
When we're trying to retrace someone's steps, we'll use any means necessary.
And in a shocking twist, this mother, who had a passion for helping find missing people, becomes a victim herself.
None of the normal scenarios were happening. It was just really disturbing.
How did she just disappear?
Someone might have hurt her, or that they could still be hurting her.
Anything's a possibility at this point still.
My name's Erin Knabel, and my sister Andrea has been missing since August 13th, 2019.
Growing up in their hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, Erin always looked up to her older sister.
She was 3 years older than me and my little sister. We called her Mother Andrea.
Going down again, 4th of July party. Party every day.
At 29 years old, Andrea fulfills a lifelong dream. She finally becomes a mother.
Andrea has two sons. They're 8 and 6, and they're really good kids. They're really smart, just like her. She always would make sure that they had home-cooked meals.
Kids are crazy.
Her house was kind of the fun house
Happy 4th of July.
that all the kids around the neighborhood would want to go play at.
And her generosity reaches far beyond her family.
Andrea got involved in Missing in America in 2016. It's a volunteer organization that helps search for people. Tracy Leonard is a private investigator. She volunteered for him when she did Missing in America, and she actually helped him find a 15-year-old boy, and I think he was really impressed with her skills.
Her work, along with, the rest of our investigators, were able to find this teenager and get them home. So, she became a friend of mine.
But on August 12th, 2019, Andrea is the one in dire need of help.
Andrea was living with my mother, of course, and she was there with Sarah and Ethan. Both of her sons are with their dads. Sarah's my little sister, and then Ethan is her fiance. They had some type of disagreement. Maybe a sarcastic comment was said, so, just a normal family thing.
Andrea leaves to blow off some steam, but when she gets home around 11:30 p.m., the doors are locked.
She couldn't get into the house when she got home. They were asleep. She walked to my house. It was just a few streets over from my mother's house. Andrea's had some troubles lately. She was laid off from her job, and she had car problems. It was just one thing after another. She was just upset. She told me she was sad that they had argued that day. We talked, and it eventually got kind of late, and it was a work night for me, and my kids were asleep. So I told her I was ready to go to sleep and that she should try to go home and rest. And I told her I'd call her parents to get them to let her in. I just expected it to blow over and the next day everything would be okay.
But everything wouldn't be okay. In the early morning hours, Andrea leaves her sister's house to walk home alone.
The next day in the morning, I sent her a message telling her that I was sorry and that I loved her. She didn't respond. My first thought was that she's just upset, so I thought maybe she was just cooling off somewhere. I made a post on Facebook just because I knew everyone would see it. I was hoping that one of them would say, I talked to her, she's fine. But it didn't happen. And we have a group text where we talk to our family members, and I asked if anyone had talked to Andrea, and everyone said no.
2 days later, and still no sign of Andrea.
I checked with her best friend. It took her a couple days to reply On the fourth day is when I found out from her that she hadn't heard from her. So that's when I knew that something was seriously wrong. And I reported her missing.
I'm Detective Mike Lauder of the Louisville Metro Police Department Missing Persons Unit. I'm the lead detective on the Andrea Knable missing persons case.
By August 17th, 2019, Andrea Knable has been missing for 4 days.
Once I get the report and start talking to the reporting party, which was Erin Knable, Andrea's sister, it's important to trace back her steps through whatever means necessary. Witnesses, phone records, Facebook Messenger, social media. The family handed over Andrea's laptop, and we were able to access Google Timeline and her Facebook Messenger through her laptop.
What the Google Timeline shows is eye-opening.
The Google Timeline eventually revealed that Andrea had made it back to Mom's house on Chickadee after she left Erin's house that night. It appears that she never went inside Mom's house when she made it over there in the early morning hours. She hung around the property for some time until the phone died.
How and why didn't she go into the house? It's a question that still can't be answered.
That's her last known location. And from that point, she essentially vanished.
At 6:31 a.m., Andrea's phone shuts off. Something isn't adding up.
The phone records revealed that she had spoken to a few people during this back and forth between Mom and her sister Erin's house. She was seeking out a ride. She was calling people saying, hey, can you come get me? And those kinds of things. Nothing that would have indicated any kind of imminent danger that she may have been in, or anybody that would have come and wanted to do her any harm. Nobody in those phone conversations or messages agreed to come pick her up.
From there, her trail goes cold. It's a bizarre timeline. Nothing seems to make sense.
Hey, this is investigator Tracy Leonard. Just wanted to give everybody a quick update.
When news of Andrea's disappearance goes public, her former coworker takes matters into his own hands.
We did multiple interviews. We have developed some pretty good leads, and we're continuing to stay focused and go forward.
He has his own company, and he volunteered to help Andrea and to help us find her. He knew her really well.
We have been door to door on several houses, but if you have a security camera, please look on your video to see if possibly Andrea's on it. Keep vigilant, keep your eyes open. We are staying positive, and we're checking every lead out we can.
We received tips that Andrea had been spotted in the Newburgh area of Louisville, which is not too far from Fincastle. And we went out, talked to witnesses, knocked on any doors that we thought, could have been a good possibility. Several fields and wooded areas in the area have been searched by countless amounts of people. And the amount of social media attention that this case has gotten has helped get the word out to try to locate Andrea. We've had sightings, and nothing has panned out. Nothing.
It feels like you're reaching your hand out, like with your palm down, and you're grabbing water, and no matter how hard you try, you can't do it. And that's how it feels when I'm looking for
Erin will never stop searching for her missing sister and mother of two, Andrea Knable.
Andrea was always there for me. She was very selfless, and that's one thing that motivates me to keep looking for her. I know for a fact she'd do it for me.
As far as Andrea's whereabouts, there's many theories out there. We're keeping all possibilities open.
I'm really hopeful that she could be okay and that she chose to leave. It's possible that she might have had some type of mental breakdown or emotional breakdown.
A lot of her personal challenges had come to a head on the night of August the 12th and August the 13th. There was some mental health concerns by the family. She got very angry when she learned that they were trying to get her mental health help. I don't know if that was cause for her to take off out of anger. The reality of it is, maybe did she commit suicide? We don't know.
When I think about that situation, it just doesn't sound like her at all. Like, it just doesn't match anything she's ever done in her life.
So far, investigators have struggled to narrow the field of possibilities.
You know, did she walk away on her own accord? Did somebody have a hand in this? Was anybody else involved?
Someone might have seen her walking and looking sad, and they might have taken advantage of that. That's definitely something we've thought about.
At this point in the investigation, there still are no signs of any foul play. There's no indication that anybody wanted to do Andrea any harm. However, we are not ruling out anything. We are still actively working the case of Andrea. We're continuing to dig through any potential phone records, any personal relationships that she may have had around the time or leading up to her disappearance.
We're not giving up. We're still going to drive forward. We're going to find her. She's a mom, and her babies need her.
This is my sister, Andrea, and her missing flyer. If you could share this on social media as many times as you possibly can, that helps tremendously to get the word out. Life just hasn't been the same without her, so we really hope to get her back soon.
A year after a local mother's disappearance, a Louisville family still is not giving up hope that she's still alive, and they'll learn what happened to her. Andrea Knebel was last seen in the early morning hours of August 13th, 2019. 1 year to date, they've received countless leads. Wave 3 News reporter Sean Bowdy tells us why the family believes newer tips could lead to some answers.
Every moment you're awake, there is very little refuge from this.
Mike Knebel stayed up early into Thursday morning, reliving in his head the last time his family knew where his daughter was.
1:38 a.m. I remembered exactly, and I counted down the clock this morning and for that, and then was so shook up I couldn't go to sleep.
Knebel says his daughter Andrea left her sister's house in Audubon Park and walked to her mother's. She made it there, but what happened after that is a mystery. In recent days, Knebel raised the reward for information leading to the recovery of his daughter, up to $10,000. There's also been interest across the country in this case on social media, and one documentary producer in Los Angeles who wants to feature Andrea's story.
It seems so hopeless. When I'm out there, and you fail every single day, every day that you don't find her, you fail. But with new interest coming in from a national perspective, we do think there's a better than even chance if she's around, if she's alive, hopefully, that these nationally exposed, nationally telecast shows will help us find her.
Thursday night, the family has planned to drive along the last known path Andrea walked in Audubon Park. Anyone with information is asked to call LMPD or the family's private investigator. That info and more can be found on this story at wave3.com. In Louisville, Sean Bowdy, Wave 3 News.
She was a mom who devoted much of her spare time to helping to find missing persons. Now the tables have turned, and she has gone missing herself. And the group she once volunteered with has joined in the search to solve the mystery.
This woman, who has dedicated her life to finding missing people, is now missing herself.
Hello, my name is Andrea Knebel.
37-year-old Andrea Knebel was last seen 2 weeks ago leaving her sister's house in Louisville on foot in the middle of the night. Her family says she was upset and going through a rough patch.
The more time that passes, the more I worry that this is it, and maybe that was the last time I was going to see her, so I'm very worried.
Now they are passing out flyers in an urgent search for the mom of 2 boys.
I'm hoping that she didn't take a ride with someone to go to someone else's house and never made it and got into the wrong car.
Andrea is a prominent volunteer with the national organization Missing in America, which assists law enforcement locating missing persons.
I've looked up the map, and it's about 13 miles away from here.
This is Andrea 5 months ago looking for a missing person in Ohio. Now she's the one the group is searching for.
She is well aware of how a missing person disappears. She would know how to disappear if she chose to.
Do you think it's possible she staged this for the attention?
I've not ruled out anything.
Police say Andrea made phone calls at around 2 a.m. the day she disappeared, but her phone has been off ever since. And police say so far they have no leads.
It's interesting. There's this case. There's this missing mother who went missing on a short walk home from her sister's that has gotten some interesting levels of attention. What caught my ear about this case was So we're like putting together like other things. We have active investigations, and then we have like things we want to cover, which are not always the same thing, because sometimes the things we want to cover, like we've already laid out the plan. But what caught my ear here is the reporter actually asked, do you think she might be doing this for the attention in one of the clips? That's a ballsy question, because I've always wondered that. It's pretty complicated to explain what we do in terms of missing persons, but that is always one of the, like, it's irresponsible not to investigate that. I'm not saying ask it or spread rumors about it or go on Facebook or true crime forums or subreddits or whatever and say that. But to ask it in a newscast was interesting to me. I wanted to highlight that case and sort of spotlight it. Although, it's on Investigation Discovery, and I'll drop links to that where people can go and learn more about that case. There's something strange about it. Not like Hannah Potts strange, like just cases like that are interesting to me. I think that people, it goes back to my skepticism. Like, it's always like, what is going on? Would people abandon their lives? And that, involving children, it gets really complicated. I don't necessarily like investigations involving children. And I think to some degree Meg doesn't. Jamie doesn't necessarily want to hear it. But Meg will look at a case and just go where it leads. And as long as you leave the gore out, she'll pretty much cover whatever case. We were having to explain ourselves. That's one of the questions that comes up in this it comes up when you're recording it. It comes up when you're pitching something bigger, but where it really comes up is with law enforcement. Like, what's your process? What are you doing? And I think they think very suspiciously of things. But part of my process is I want to know, like, is there any possibility, is this not real, or like this is much simpler than it seems? Because most of the cases I get my hands on are very old cases, very cold cases. That case stood out. And I decided to call Meg and say, hey, how about we talk about our process?
Welcome to another summer season episode of True Crime XS. Today we're going to try and talk about how we got into all of this in the first place. And ultimately, where does it lead?
You bring up a good point there, but a lot of the things that we talk about end up, like, they have more interesting aspects to video. And like today is like kind of one of those things. This is like the question that I've had a hard time answering from everybody. They say, what is your process? Like, what is the thing that makes what you guys do unique? Which is what brought me back around to, one, some of the topics we've been talking about recently, but two, sort of the methods to, in our text messages recently, I've been calling them matches. And you're right, like, this sort of would be the thing to film, I guess, is like how we do that. There's a lot of research that goes into each side of this.
Right, and it's really boring to watch somebody sitting there staring at a screen or whatever. Like, there's not a whole lot to see. Like, I don't know. We started doing the whole element of doing, a visual representation of it, like a video version. It's new, and so I'm having to wrap my brain around it. So
I understand that.
I experimented with some stuff, and I think some stuff, I think it will open up some. But like, as far as exposing my life, I don't know how you feel about it. I just like my side of like, if we're going to make a video, fine, but this is what that would be like.
Well, exactly, and that's ultimately what I'm wrestling with right now. Is because, like, I don't know how well my process would actually film either, and that I like the idea. I sort of pitched it as a joke when I started because it's always interesting to me what catches people's eye, because I literally have a dozen scripts up there, and sometimes I'll go months and nobody asks about any of them. Sometimes out of the blue, I'll get a bunch of producers on the phone. In the midst of all that, I pitched True Crime XS as a joke initially, thinking, I wonder what people would say to this. And, it doesn't cost anything to do that when people are already sort of looking for you and seeing what you're doing. So the interest actually kind of took me aback, and it took a minute to talk to people in my house, to talk to them about it. Jamie's sort of on board for anything. She likes the idea of us going to these places. She likes the travel aspect. She's like, if I got a film to go do that, I'll do it. And so that's a little different. And she and I were actually talking about some of the specific cases that I had run down happen in this one area, but they're two different time periods. And she was even thinking, well, what if Meg goes with us there and we just film that? Because that was going to Caldwell Fields and meeting Parks Police there to discuss it. Like, what if we just went to that area, filmed what we're thinking happened, and see if we can find anything? You know, all that comes up. The answer is, I don't have a documentable process that will make much sense or be very interesting, I don't think.
To a certain extent, well, I don't really know how to put it, because I think it's going to sound bad if you kind of dole this down, but I'm not giving away my process. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to be a butt about it.
I understand that part of it, and that it's not even that I don't want to give it away. It's that I don't know that I could accurately articulate enough for someone as a third-party observer to be able to capture it. Because what I realized was you can document me reading a lot of stuff. I mean, this week there were different FBI files that aren't related to Israel Keys that you and I had kicked around back and forth and discussed. And when we do that, I'll read. And I think I read a total of 400 pages this week that were, interesting to me. But there's not a lot that you can prove with it. And the ultimate results of it are something clicks in my head that I can then start to articulate where I'm headed with it. And what I had told you I wanted to talk about was matches. And that, right. I think that's a weird thing to explain to people. So if someone were asking me and trying to pin it down and document it, and I were telling people what I do, it's usually not related to how I end up,
right?
Or to where I end up. You find that to be true for you?
Yeah, I agree with that. And the other thing is, it's not necessarily a step-by-step process that you could put out there and guaranteed duplication would result the same, because that's not really what ends up happening.
It's investigating, and we honestly follow where it leads.
Right. Okay. So, for example, on a match, and what you mean by that is a logical conclusion between a missing person and an unidentified body that is officially listed as such. Right?
That is correct.
Okay. So, with a match, you can, I'm sure most people don't do this, but I actually, when I am bored and I can't find, something low bar to watch, as far as hitting my low bar of expectations, I look through missing people. I am interested in it, and I can, I'll start from the beginning of the list or the end of the list, and I'll come up with some sort of time period or something to narrow down the 14,000 results that come if you don't put any parameters in. And I start going through them. And there are different things in history that are factual to the extent that they're ever going to be factual. Different serial killers operating, different things occurring. And when I'm randomly looking at whatever the parameters I've decided they're going to be, you start seeing patterns, or you start realizing, well, for one thing, there's not as many missing people and found people when you start breaking it down. At any given time, a high percentage of the unidentified bodies that are listed as such on NamUs, I feel like the key to their identification lies therein. Not all the time, obviously. Every missing body is not reported missing. I mean, every unidentified body is not that of a missing person. But I've noticed some things over time that I think are overlooked. And what I mean by that is NamUs is designed specifically to cross-reference found bodies and missing people, which seems logical, and it is logical. But it's all cross-reference based on data entry from human beings. And so I think a lot of the times one little mistake here or there can cause the connection not to be made. And so from there, okay, so if NamUs hasn't made the connection, you know, how on earth could I possibly make the connection? Well, if you start looking and you can reasonably adjust for whatever parameter was erroneously entered. And you and I talked about this at some point. I said, you know, if I were to go missing, what would my description be that you would give police right now? And the point of that was, like, how accurate is the reporting person in describing the missing person? How far can it be off? What is how far is it off before NamUs, you know, doesn't make the connection? That type of thing. Because you can't trust every single thing to an algorithm that's trying to make matches. And so based on that, if I start looking at stuff, I can make matches. Now, are they accurate? I don't know. I don't have access to the DNA. It basically boils down to a logical suggestion, is what, from looking at unidentified bodies or missing people, the circumstances that they were found or disappeared, the time frame, how many, a lot of times there will be an unidentified body that only has one logical missing person that it could be. Now, is it possible that it's not that missing person? Absolutely. But if they haven't been excluded as a match, I feel like that's, you know, an avenue that should be explored, because it could be one less missing person and one less unidentified body out there waiting to rest in peace, essentially.
Right. And so to clarify two things that you said. First of all, the idea behind NamUs is that it would be sort of a center place that was cross-jurisdictional and ultimately would become a collection point between, not just between cities and between states, but also between federal versus local avenues that might not be explored in the typical process of a law enforcement investigation, to basically make a pool of three types of things, and that is missing persons, unidentified human remains, but also unclaimed persons. And there's technically a fourth category, which is living unclaimed persons.
That they're just lumped together, right?
Right. They lump together the living versus the passed away, and they sort of end up there. So that's the first clarification. Just like it is cross-jurisdictional. That's the idea, that there is a national database.
And so it is designed specifically to, hold on, I want to get this right. Okay. It's designed to address the nation's silent mass disaster. That is the point of it. It is premised on the sheer volume of missing and unidentified person cases poses one of the greatest challenges to agencies tasked with resolving these important cases. And then statistically, 600,000 individuals go missing every year. 4,400 unidentified bodies are recovered each year. I don't know if this is the right time to address this or not. 600,000 people may go missing every year, but I would say a very high percentage of those people are also found during that year. A lot of people who go missing aren't actually missing.
Right. They're either found deceased or they're found to be living and potentially safe.
Correct. And actually that's, in most cases, they're found alive and well and not missing. Now, I think that the statistics on that are very misleading, but, not the time or the place, I guess, to really put that out there. But one thing that it does address is it has a set of parameters that are required for every case that's put in. And it typically requires law enforcement involvement. So random people can't list random other people as missing people. So it's pretty credible. And you and I have had the discussion before about missing people are not by default law enforcement's business. And it isn't completely, adults can go missing. You can choose to leave your life behind and walk away. And law enforcement, aside from figuring that out and passing that information along, that would be all their role would be in that. Now, so a lot of cases that I see on it for reported missing people are just cases where somebody dropped out of their normal life. And then I think a vast majority of cases, foul play is readily apparent. I don't know if you found that or not.
I think foul play and suicide are the two things that stand out as the strongest possibilities when they're probably statistically the case. You can see them in most cases.
Right. And so until I started doing this type of research, it never once occurred to me that somebody would leave their life behind without telling everybody, I'm leaving my life behind, forget you, or whatever. And so that was something new for me to wrap my head around, because I've always been like a very direct person. And I would just say, I no longer want you people in my life, so I'm going on with my own life. I would never just leave. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does
I would
make sense.
make sure everybody knew. So the fact that, and actually I found that it's usually about middle age, midlife crisis. Those types of people, a lot of times I feel like, and actually a lot of those people that leave their lives behind, they do end up committing suicide. I mean, some of them start their lives over somewhere else, but it's sad because, I feel like a lot of those cases are clogging up the system. Now, why do I say that? Well, because when an adult decides that they want to leave their life, I don't consider them a missing person, regardless of what they do with it. If they commit suicide, that's their business. If they go start a new life, that's their business. And so I don't look into those cases typically. There has to be more to it for me to go further with that. Another thing that I see in missing people cases, and this has to do more with children, non-custodial abductions, when the other parent the parents don't get along, and the parent that doesn't have custody of the children takes them away or violates the visitation agreement or whatever. I tend to kind of gloss over those, not because I don't care. It's just there's domestic type things run so deep, and they already have so many problems that I don't want to compound it by making suggestions that I might make about the kind of things I looked into applying to those cases. But most of the time, children who are missing are runaways that end up being found. So not even runaways that end up being dead, but runaways that end up being found. Or it's a case where they're perfectly safe, they're just with the other parent, and so custodially they're not with the right parent. And the only thing I can say about that is we should tell people to, pick carefully who they're going to have children with. I don't know. Beyond that, I do think there could be a rare instance where there could be some foul play involved. But even then, I would say the very first place to look would be the non-custodial parent who has kidnapped the children or who has them against, a visitation agreement. But, okay, so could it be possible that there's a situation where parents have split custody, children are with the wrong parent, and then somehow in the course of that, the wrong parent and the children get abducted by a serial killer and killed. I mean, I guess it's possible, but it doesn't seem very probable to me because that would be a whole lot going wrong there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So a couple of things about what you just said. First of all of what we do here is precipitated by the people that are actually reported missing. So there's always the possibility that they just weren't reported missing, which is a sort of a subsection that we can't apply anything to. If they're not reported missing or no one acknowledges they're missing, those people,
they don't exist as far as we're concerned.
Those people don't come into play with what we're doing.
Just the concept that there is always the possibility that this could be a missing person who is not reported missing. That's it.
Right. And we found that that's rarer with children. And I would say there are, okay, so I agree with the non-custodial parent angle completely when it's between two parents. I think there's a smaller subsection of that, and that subsection is that the children are essentially some form of ward of the state, and the parents have decided that they're going to take the children. That's small, but it happens. And that would be like a couple is together, the child ends up in foster care, the child is taken, the foster parents report them missing.
But they're really with the parents.
They're really just with the parents, and the parents have decided that, they're going to live off the grid. That happens as well. And then I would say one of the rarer things we found in general is stranger abductions, specifically stranger abductions of children. Those are that's way down the totem pole of things that would happen. And I would say what you just described, and that is a potentially non-custodial parent or an adversarial parent, because it's not always, in what I've read, it's not always necessarily, sometimes it's the non-custodial parent reporting the missing, because the custodial parent has decided not to agree to the order. So that happens. But for one of those parents and a child to go missing is the rarest of things to happen.
One of which parents?
Like if a custodial or a non-custodial parent and a child were to be abducted, I said missing, but I think the better word is abducted. That would be
it never happens, literally.
It's never documented, so it would be the rarest of instances. Say that's
not to say it couldn't happen. It would.
We don't have evidence. We don't have evidence of it.
Right.
So those things, and we've looked at the very rare stranger abductions. We've gone into detail on those. I want to point out one thing, the second thing from earlier, but I just want to say, you said when we're looking at these and comparing these cases that we're looking for slight errors sometimes. But there's also another factor that I think has two components to it. One is who reported them missing. The person reporting them missing makes all the difference in the world. If it's a girlfriend, it is very different than a sibling. If it is a close sibling versus an estranged sibling, that's a different scenario. So it's not just...
Do you find that NamUs overcomes that or no?
I think that getting into NamUs itself is usually a sign that it's probably overcome.
A legitimate report.
Usually. I think the older the report is, the more complicated it is to answer that question. If we're looking at something...
But they don't... My understanding is they don't, every law enforcement agency in probably the entire world, but since we're just talking about the United States, they have a different policy on what, and they're allowed to, what constitutes them taking a missing persons report and when they get involved, right? And so my understanding is that law enforcement has to be the one who puts it into NamUs. Is that right? Because I'm pretty sure even if you contact NamUs and say, I've got a missing person, they would say, you need to go to this, and they would help you. But like if I contacted NamUs and I said, you know, my brother has gone missing, they would say, okay, well, we're here to help, but you need to contact like whatever agency nearby that I would need to contact to make that report. And then they would go from there. Like, so in a little ways, if it's just a boyfriend that's ghosted his girlfriend, I don't think it's going to get to NamUs, but I would take that into consideration as well. A lot of times I would say parents reporting adult children missing is the same type of thing. Like the kids have just left their life and they're probably out living happily ever after somewhere else, or miserably ever after, just not in contact with the family. And I know that a lot of times people have a really hard time believing somebody left, but some people just can't take it and they leave, and it really does happen. Now, the other side of that is somebody leaving their life, purposefully leaving, and then dying, like in a manner that suggests foul play. That makes things get more complicated. Looking over, NamUs has a long history of missing people, you know, cases that are never, ever going to be solved. And it can be really overwhelming. Now, is it actually the nation's silent mass disaster? What do you think about that statement?
I have one more thing, and then I will answer the question, I promise. I just wanted to say this to you. One of the things we discovered is sometimes there are user entries in NamUs. They don't last very long. That means it is a layperson in all capitals putting in their cousin Jerry from 1992 in 2018, and those cases don't last in there. I'm just clarifying that because as we're talking, I'm coming across a couple of them that I will give you later just to see these examples. But that does happen. They don't last very long in there.
You can usually tell because, you know, one of the entry points in NamUs is circumstances of disappearance. And when there are no details available, it is unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that foul play is involved.
Oh, no. I'm just referencing when they have no case agents of any kind or no reference to a law enforcement contact.
I don't even see how those get in. That's really weird. But, I mean, I believe you if you say it. It's not like I've looked at every single thing.
No, I don't actually. I just wanted to clarify that from the perspective that I have seen a few of those over the years. I thought they didn't last as long, but now that I'm looking through here, there are some of those in here. And the other thing that comes from that, the reason for that, before we get to the nation's mass disaster, the accuracy of that information, like you said, the circumstances, but also the clothing that they're wearing, that all changes with who reported what and what law enforcement agent was entering that information. It could be the difference between someone knowing what logo was on a shirt versus someone not even knowing what that person wears these days. So that information that we get, first of all, is wholly dependent on third parties that have filled this information out long before we ever even see it.
Right.
And, you know, you asked, is this the nation's mass disaster? I feel like it is highly dramatized.
Right. And I don't want to, and so that's not to say that we're putting down anybody who's legitimately missing under circumstances of foul play, because that's not what I'm saying.
No. That's definitely not. I didn't get the impression that's what you were saying either.
Okay.
But when we look at what NamUs is, what I think NamUs represents is that it's a problem that has to be chipped away in small pieces. And I do think they made the right call in making the database public, because then you know, whether citizens detectives can solve anything or not, sometimes they can see things that although NamUs is built to overcome, it can't because of the simple number of records involved. That's the real mass disaster, is how much paperwork is just not in the right place as other paperwork that would make these matches and essentially cull this, you know, database down to what reality.
Right. And so in reality, and I don't know what parameters we would put on that. Maybe I think all cases are solvable, but if you were to say, let's narrow it down to the provable cases. So that would be, taking anybody that would be 120 years old at this point if they were found off the list. It would be a very small number, I think. I think that there are very few legitimately missing people who did not go missing on their own accord, and that foul play, or you could even say an accident is involved. I don't think I think that the stigma of this potential serial murder, the potential that I could be a serial killer victim, okay, I think it's way overplayed, and I think that there's a lot more reasonable, logical explanations for a lot of people's disappearances.
That sentence is really important. And it's not only important, but it ripples. Everything ripples. And the idea that you could be a serial killer's victim ripples one way, but the idea that you could narrow down who was a serial killer's victim ripples a different way. And that is, if we can glean out and rule out, not you and I personally, but as a system, if we can rule out 90% of the possibilities, then the other 10% make it easier to actually see what serial killers are doing. I don't know exactly how you come across cases. I know recently I had an interesting case out of Virginia that I came across because I was looking for something completely different. I was, in the course of what we're doing right now, I was trying to make matches that I was thinking the way you think would be ruled out. Does that make sense? Like,
right.
This is obviously an accident. This is obviously a suicide. This is obviously, whatever parameters I could put on them. And I've been talking to two different people, and I have been wrapping up some of the Israel Keys stuff in order to, what we've discussed, make video possible to go and look for victims in places that were logical. One of the cases I came across was very interesting. And I'm not trying to derail you. If you have something else to say, please, I will let you do that.
I go ahead.
This is like the closest I can come to like giving an example of how the process works for me. And that is, I was looking for remains that have been found in parks, trying to rule out a theory. The theory is irrelevant because it didn't come to fruition. But I had started with, just a little hypothesis, like if this, then this. Well, in the course of that, I found a 5 foot, I think he's 5'6" or 5'7" tall Asian male wearing a specific outfit whose bones had been found at least a year post-mortem. So his bones had been in this location for at least a year. Okay. And he had articles of clothing on him. So I was like looking at him for one thing related to two different serial killers from the Northeast, one of which was Israel Keys. I looked at the date that he had been found. And then I said, okay, I know he was not alive at that point because there were bones there. Previous to that, how many Asian males of that height went missing? And then I started in Virginia, which is where the bones were. And then I expanded it out 3 states. I included West Virginia, I included Kentucky, I included North Carolina. And then after slowly ruling people out for different reasons, I kept expanding and I got to New York. His shirt on the bones was recorded with a logo and a photo of it. And it just happened that related to a Staten Island parking lot service in a greater New York parking lot service. Well, there was one Asian male in the right time frame missing, wearing that, thought to be wearing possibly a polo shirt. Now, it didn't say polo shirt with this logo, So that gentleman, to me, is a very good match for the gentleman with the logo on his shirt. And I hunt down the case agents from both sides. The case agent that has the missing persons report in Staten Island is with a unit that I happen to know has like 4,000 cases rotating at a time, because they don't just deal with missing persons. So I reached out to the U.S. Parks Police and I laid out this gentleman this time, these bones this time, and referred to all of the information that was in NamUs to see if it could make a match. The reason I did that was because there was a strong possibility, the way the jurisdictions were laid out, that it would be years from now before that match was made on its own. The cases for matches that end up interesting me usually aren't serial killer cases. They're cases that are deaths that you know have happened because you have the bones, and missing persons that match them to some degree. You did a tremendous amount of work in a very short period of time related to a T-shirt I found on a victim, because I wanted to know when they could have gotten that T-shirt, thrift stores aside, which it still could be a thrift store T-shirt, but I was able to make some interesting connections there. I don't have a possibility yet. You presented 3 possibilities afterwards. And that is one way that you can match interesting unidentified persons cases to missing persons cases to basically clear out the system. You're culling down the database by doing that.
Right. And I think that would be my best way to describe the methodology there. So what you said, you have to use a set of logical things to make conclusions. Now, an algorithm can't think like that, because there are numerous possibilities once the parameter has been kicked out. So, a computer operates off of a database full of height, weight, color of hair, color eyes, that kind of thing. And so I don't know how the cross-reference is done. I don't know if it's a retroactive cross-reference, meaning that, does everything put in automatically get compared? So there's a lot of things that I think are questionable. I don't know. At least there is something there. Now, if you spend any time on NamUs, you will see there are a lot of people who have never been excluded as any unidentified bodies. There are unidentified bodies that have never been excluded as missing people. Is that above and beyond the automatic cross-reference? I don't know exactly what's happening there. It does seem strange, though, that it hasn't, when something comes up and it hasn't been excluded from anything, how's that possible? It seems like it would be excluded from everything before. Now, that may be where there's been actual DNA cross-reference done.
Right, and that's the other thing that comes up. So I think it's a matter of what the algorithm misses is the manual cross-reference between the parking attendant's logo and the fact that it was never entered on the other side. There is no match to be made there except for the visual reference and then looking up what that logo means. So I see a picture of the logo on a shirt. I go hunting to find out what that logo means, and that expands the jurisdiction. That's something you have to do manually. Secondarily, you don't know that there's DNA on both sides, because not all missing persons cases have DNA entered into the database to begin with. Because that's something that the CSI age has made us sort of. I would say it's a hyperbole to expect that every missing persons case, it's a major exaggeration to expect that DNA is available in every missing persons case. Right, and there is a famous quote that I can't think of who said it. You probably will know, but it is to the effect of, once you've gone through all the impossibilities, what is actually possible has to be it. That's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That's Sherlock Holmes. Yeah. And so, and that is a lot of what my work is based on. A lot of it. A lot of it is a matter of
research that I waste a lot of time doing, because a lot of times, and as soon as I hit a wall, I'm actually sort of happy that, I hit the wall and it's not them or whatever. But it's a lot of like, okay, is there, who went missing? Who could this be? Okay, do they show up anywhere else ever again? And, it's that kind of thing. A process of elimination that is much easier with cases that are older, because there is this process of elimination. I think is lacking in, the automatic cross-reference is the methodology that you got to take it case by case, and you've got to, rule things out, just like you said. And I think that is the key to making these matches on NamUs. Now, there's a lot of pushback, not understanding completely that just because it didn't match doesn't mean it's not a match. Are you following me?
Yeah.
And so the thought is, well, the system would have caught that, and it is therefore a waste of time to attempt to make a match here. That is like just banging your head against the wall, because for years and years, everybody that I've matched is the match to the person, to the unidentified body, or the missing person is a match. Then there's no reason we should have that many. Now, why is it so easy? I don't know. Maybe it's not easy. Maybe what I'm saying doesn't really make sense to anybody else. But I think that it is really easy for a person who this is their job. They go to work and their thought is, oh yeah, the system would have caught it. Well, yeah, sure. But the system is made by people, and people make mistakes, and you're talking on two ends here. I think that, especially with unidentified remains, a lot of it's guesswork. I see that there are a lot of professionals who are very talented in doing that guesswork. I would never say that, it isn't possible for them to be mistaken, because I think that is a lot of the cases. It's just a mistake, assuming somebody is taller or shorter than they are, or heavier or lighter than they are, like that kind of thing. It can lead to literally somebody not being identified for 30 years or however long, but just kind of breaking it down. And essentially, we are just trying to help make matches. We make them to the extent we can. So in other words, and I don't want to come off like we're just pulling theories out of our rear ends, because that's not really what we're doing. And we pass it along to the people who could actually make the matches, and it's trying to help them. So is it possible that this missing person could be this unidentified person? And the reasons why we think it's possible.
Right. A lot of times, so I do reach out to not just NamUs. Typically, I try to reach out first to whoever has the case, because if they look at it, they may already have the information systemically sitting there that they can disagree or agree with me. And like,
right.
I don't turn in rule outs. I don't turn in like super obvious stuff. I'm usually looking for something else when I come across one of these. So the first case I mentioned, I was looking for things related to this particular U.S. park, and I found a different thing. I didn't mean to find that. But you came up with, in the course of like things we've been looking at recently, you hit on something that you wanted me to look at in Vegas. And that was another example of how information on one end not matching the other end prohibits the type of matching you're talking about, when it seems like it's probably accurate. But what I found interesting about, do you mind if I mention this case? Because I did report it.
I don't mind if you mention it. The reason that is so far back in my mind that I can't remember the details. So yeah, go ahead.
I'll do the details and whatnot. But essentially what happened was this gentleman leaves his home and he goes on a walk. And this is an example of how weird policing in America is. This gentleman leaves his house and goes on a walk, purportedly to the corner store, which is not very far from his home. And it's in Las Vegas, and it's the jurisdiction of the Las Vegas Police Department. And you came across a corresponding match of human remains being found a little, like a year later, or maybe a little more than a year. But essentially, the remains fell into the jurisdiction of the North Las Vegas Police Department.
Michael Stephen Cecina was last seen leaving his residence at approximately 9 a.m. to walk to the 7-Eleven store at Russell and Mountain Vista Roads in Las Vegas, Nevada. He did not intend to be gone long and did not take much money with him, if any. Mr. Cecina would walk to the store, mostly for exercise. He even left clothes in the washing machine that he intended to finish up when he got back, and took no other clothing with him. He has not been seen or heard from since December 22nd, 1986. Michael Cecina was around 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed around 225 pounds. He was 34 years old. His nickname was Mike. He has brown hair and brown eyes. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a black jacket. His case remains unsolved.
Their opinion of that case was they assigned the remains to the Traffic Investigations Division.
Right, like he had been hit by a car.
Right. So the theory was that he had been hit by a car. But for some reason, even though this unidentified set of human remains matches in a lot of ways this missing person, the match had not been made. So I reached out to both sides of that one.
On February 17, 1987, in North Las Vegas, Nevada, a decedent was discovered in the desert area around a group of bushes. The remains were badly decomposed. The decedent had injuries consistent with a possible auto-pedestrian accident. However, homicidal assault is not ruled out. The unidentified decedent was approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall and of an undetermined weight. He was estimated to have a post-mortem interval of 4 weeks. He is thought to be between 50 and 65 years old. He is male and Caucasian. In the details of the recovery, the condition of the remains were not recognizable.
And I just said, hey, I think that you guys should look at whether or not this gentleman matches. Now, what's interesting is the missing person was not the type of person that I think they have DNA on file, because I think it was like a roommate that reported him missing.
Right.
So, it's 1986. It's a roommate it was not a long-term connection who reported him missing. Does that make sense?
Right, but roommates are allowed to report. Usually it's next of kin, but in the event that, it's somebody that you live with, they can report you missing. So right. I know that he didn't have a lot of close family. His disappearance was not ever in any spotlight. I mean, it just wasn't. And I assume that's because he wasn't married or he didn't have children, or I don't know, the different things that could have been the case. But essentially, it was a very short time. Everything lined up as far as the missing person and the unidentified body that was found to be him. Now, it was, a little more north than one might expect but another thing that went into me sort of making that connection was the lack of other possibilities. Somebody,
for either of them.
Right. And so, there was not another. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be somebody who hasn't been reported missing, but I know that they weren't excluded as being each other, for one thing. So if they had been excluded as being one another for whatever reason, officially, that's it. I don't go further. Just based on what I was looking at, I thought, well, that's a shame, that they haven't figured that out, because, and I can't remember why else maybe, but I do think it was just like the cross of the jurisdictions And then the fact that, so the body was found out more towards the desert. They haven't completely ruled out foul play, but I believe I read it was most likely that the body had been hit by a car. He was walking to the store. It makes perfect sense that he would have been hit by a car. I don't know. The reason he's further north is it's possible somebody panicked and, you know, put his body in the car and went and dumped it. I mean, you know, the kind of thing that goes through my mind, because when he's the only person that's missing or reported missing from that period of time, and that's the only random body found, and the circumstances mesh up together, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't want to make sure. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, certainly they've looked into that, but why aren't they listed as exclusions for one another? I don't know. Did you make the connection? So I found this, and the reason was the missing person showed up just on like the daily list for whatever reason. So if you go and you log in to NamUs, there'll be a random list of, I think it might be cases that have been updated. I'm not really sure. But for whatever reason, this guy's smiling face was right there. And I was like, huh. And so really quickly, I looked and I came across the body that had been found in a very close amount of time. It was reported the manner of death was most likely a car accident. He had a pedestrian that had been hit by a car. Now, when I gave you that information, how skeptical were you?
There were some differences in the clothing type and the jurisdiction. And like, it was one of those things that in order to follow your train of thinking, I had to put a few minutes in where I pulled up a map and I looked at the time frame. And I think ultimately what I decided was you just have two different people's descriptions of essentially the same person, and they would never automatically match. And then I sort of went, well, I don't know that you could this many years later, you know, because it was, you know, when you're looking at something that's 34 years old, I don't think there's going to be DNA. Partly my skepticism was quickly abated by sort of following what I thought was your train of thinking. Not necessarily your train of thinking, but like my perception of it. And I went, well, if this guy's been laying here, his gray sweatpants would probably have turned brown in the dust, and his white T-shirt it was like that type of thinking. I realized that no algorithm or no automatic match was going to pick him up.
Right, because it's really easy, in my opinion, for little things like that to throw off entirely valid matches. The biggest thing about that for me, now if I had found 10 other people that had gone missing close to that area around that same time, I would not have been as quick to make that connection. It has to be somebody. The body found has to be somebody, right? It does. It has to be a person. It makes the most sense. And if you get into doing this kind of thing, you sort of realize that like, for example, in that case, if it's not the missing person that I felt like matched the unidentified remains, it's a person that was not reported missing, essentially. Okay. Because it's so close and it is really the only option, if it is in fact a reported missing person. It's not that I'm making any big jumps to get there. It's literally, there's years stretching between when the next possible person could be, which obviously that makes it not possible. But you see what I'm saying? Like, it really,
absolutely,
you can come across these cases where it's really, really hard to discount that it is a match.
The other side of it, you know, they can run it down without going down a giant rabbit hole like we do sometimes.
Man, that's all I ever do, it seems like.
So in the course of you doing that, I also, like, I have been looking at these Colorado cases, and I haven't mentioned a lot about them, but there's this one. I had a candidate for somebody I mentioned in the Israel Keys season, which is this guy found up at the Sky Shoots in Colorado. And I'm going to
I'm going to mention him here and come back to him a little later on in the. I think this is going to end up being a series of episodes. I don't think I have a choice because there's so much going on here. But I found a match that was similar to the Asian gentleman, and that was a match where it was a guy who worked at a very particular brand very particular name brand grocery store. He did a thing, like he had a job there that left him with, I mean, I guess I could say what he did. He was a butcher.
Victor Lee Abeda was last seen in Grand Junction, Colorado on May 5th, 1998. Victor Abeda was around 5 feet 11 inches tall. He weighed approximately 180 pounds. At the time he went missing, he was 47 years old. He was wearing a blue coat, white t-shirt, and black jeans, with white tennis shoes. Victor had numerous scars on his hands and fingers from working with a meat grinder. His case remains unsolved.
And the way that he, cutting meat and stuff, he had particular scars. So I ended up finding a body that matched him that was out of the geographical surface. This didn't end up being related to my case at all, but he was a very good match. But what I ran into on that case was where the remains were found were behind a casino. And the casino that they were behind have tribal police that their chain of command covers 3 states.
On May 15th, 1999, in Laughlin, Nevada, 911 was contacted by an unknown person reporting a body floating in the Colorado River north of the Avi Casino. The body was recovered from the river by the Fort Mojave Fire Department. In the details of the recovery, the condition of the remains was reported as not recognizable. The body was reported to be a 5 feet 11 inches tall Caucasian male who weighed 174 pounds with dark-colored hair, a mustache and beard that were partly gray, and a partly receding hairline. On the body were gray sweatpants, a black jacket, and striped shirt. The black jacket had a monogram name, Lee, L-E-E, on the front. He was wearing a discolored sock and white tennis shoe on the left foot. The white tennis shoe had the word power on the leather uppers and the word tunnel on the rubbery heels. The case of this unidentified person remains unsolved.
And there was no one to tell. So I ended up having to speak with NamUs directly because this case was from the 80s, and they looked at it and they went, well, okay, thanks.
I was recently looking into some other stuff, and this is kind of funny because I actually punched in the wrong year. And in doing so, I was looking for little children that were missing, and I meant to put in 50 something, but instead I ended up putting in 30 something. So it would be 1930 something. And I happened upon a found body of a child, and it just so happened that the child was found with another child and an adult female. And so NamUs had nothing to offer as far as that goes. I don't remember if the report indicated that they were family or not, but so I immediately started looking for a mom and 2 kids that had gone missing.
And this is VPR News. I'm Liam Connors. It was May 15th, 1935, when the skeletal remains of 3 murder victims were found in East Middlebury, Vermont. It's thought that they were a woman and 2 boys, perhaps a mother and her sons, all shot in the head. 80 years later, the case remains unsolved. Middlebury police reopened it last year and recently enlisted the help of forensic imaging specialist Joe Mullins from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. His job? To create clay sculptures of 2 of the victims' faces in hopes of identifying them. VPR's Alex Keefe talked with Mullins and asked him what we do know about the case.
I got introduced to this case with a class I put together with the New York Academy of Arts, and it was the first of its kind where every student was working on an active case. Only had 2 of the 3 victims. We ended up with just the younger child and the mother. It was a gunshot wound to the top of the head, and it was the skull of a 10-year-old little boy. And one of the other students ended up doing the reconstruction of the mother, all with bullet wounds to the head. What's another, tragic aspect of doing this work, as you're holding the skull of a 10-year-old little boy that was shot in the head. I love my job, but sometimes it's got to hold back the tears sometimes. It's hard not to get emotionally attached.
What you end up with is this very lifelike clay sculpture of what this person's face could have looked like. Can you walk us through the process of how you create this? Everybody's
skull is just as unique as your face. If you have 10 skulls of 10 individuals lined up on a table, an anthropologist can tell you attached or detached earlobes, the projection of your nose, the thickness of your lips, your hairline, where your eyelids attach, where your eyebrows are. All the information about you that makes you the individual that you are is etched into your skull. So given those parameters to work within, you go through and build up the face, slowly. You apply tissue depth markers that are averages for the age and ancestry of each victim. You set, eyes in the orbits. You lay on, muscles. Then you slowly start to build up the face, feature by feature. Doing the eyebrows, the eyelids, the nose, the lips, and eventually, when you get to a point where you see that person is staring back at you.
Yeah, I can imagine there's a lot of emotional weight that goes with doing this work, and I also imagine you're spending a lot of time with this.
It takes to do, from start to finish, from bare skull to finished, sculpture, doing it that way with traditional methods with clay. It takes about a week, easy. That's all day, 9 to 5. You can't help but get attached to the work. I'll always remember this case, but I always have. I could tell you probably in detail every skull that I've worked on.
Which has been hundreds, as I gather.
Hundreds. I still see all their faces. The line I said, the faces staring back at me, I've got thousands of faces staring back at me.
These 3 particular victims that were found in Vermont were found as skeletons all the way back in 1935, which I gather means they must have been killed sometime before that. All these decades later, do you have any realistic hope that making these sculptures could break open this case?
I'm the most hopeful person in the world with this. I mean, there's cases where you never would have guessed that it would have been solved, but that still the right person could see it. It could spark some memory. If they follow up the investigation and find maybe a living relative and do a DNA comparative, and then there you go, case solved. We say it's such an old case, why do it? I say, why not? They still deserve their names back.
And possibly not been reported missing because if you look at NamUs, there's not a mom and 2 kids that are missing with the specifications, the broad specifications that were laid out. Because basically it was like one was, 5 to 6, like that type of age. And the other one was a little older, like from, 10 to 13 or something like that. So you're looking for clear to, that kind of gap. And then I don't know if it talked about how old the mom was or not.
From the Burlington Free Press on October 30th, 2016, by Detective Chris Bowdish and State Archivist Tanya Marshall. What happens to an 80-year-old cold case that hasn't had a lead in more than 70 years? How do you identify the victims of a violent crime 80 years after they were discovered? Can the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration be the link to solve a 1935 triple homicide cold case? Wednesday, May 15th, 1935. Began like any other day in Vermont. For Mary Digg and her 18-year-old daughter, Inez Perry, that day included an afternoon walk in the woods in search of mayflowers. They were on an old logging road, a little more than 4 miles outside of Middlebury. On the way back from their hunt, a white rock caught Inez Perry's eye, and without much thought, she gave it a kick. But the rock did not roll out and tumble across the ground as expected. Instead, it turned out to reveal that it was not a rock at all, but rather a human skull. By nightfall, Middlebury Sheriff Ralph G. Sweet and Addison County State's Attorney John T. Conley, along with several residents, uncovered the skeletal remains of a mother and her 2 children. The case was immediately classified a homicide, as all 3 had suffered apparent gunshot wounds to their skulls. The case was vigorously investigated by Detective Almo B. Franzoni of the Vermont Attorney General's Office. A nationwide search of missing persons as well as possible suspects, was launched, but neither the victims nor the killer had ever been identified. After haunting Vermont public officials and law enforcement for more than 80 years, archival records recently helped shed some light on the case's many twists and turns. The victims in the case were reported to be a mother, approximately 35 to 45 years old, and her 2 children. One was about 9 to 11 years old, and the other thought to be 13 to 15. Further examinations by various doctors at the time concluded that the 3 victims were all members of the same family due to similarities in their bone structure and what appeared to be a tendency toward anemia. Early reports show the children were a boy and girl, but then later reports state that it was 2 boys. The most striking evidence in this case, and perhaps the greatest lead, was found within the skulls. While all had had some form of dental work, one of the victims, the eldest child, had extensive dental work including a gold band encircling the entire set of teeth in the upper jaw with an angles ribbon. The dental work was valued at $1,500 at the time. The 3 skeletal remains were found on the side of a remote logging road leading to the Brookins Blackmare hunting camp in East Middlebury, reported by a local newspaper as being dumped unceremoniously under a pine tree right near the road. The bodies were discovered under a thin layer of pine needles and leaves and bound tight in what was initially described as an army duffel bag. A small tree root, about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, had grown over the leg of one of the victims. That evening, Sheriff Sweet returned to the site with Dr. Lowell Walker, the regional medical examiner. Walker reported that he was unable to determine the gender or age of the 3 victims, but that each had died from a shot clean through the head. In the following 48 hours, details of the crime scene started to take shape. While the bodies were originally reported as being found naked, the reality was that only bones remained, meaning that they had been exposed to the elements for 3 to 5 years. All 3 victims appeared to have been killed in an identical manner, one single shot to the temple, a crime that investigators thought possibly occurred while they were sleeping, since remnants of a pillow were also found. Other evidence included a few hanks of matted hair, described as both blonde and dark, possibly auburn, with some of the strands being several inches long, a small piece of a woman's silk dress, badly disintegrated remains of a black, possibly green, and buff striped awning, 4 small block pulleys, the corner of a woolen blanket, and the snap from an automobile side curtain. A flattened .38 caliber copper-jacketed bullet, consistent with a Colt automatic, was also found under one of the skulls. The investigation began in earnest the day after the remains were found. Sheriff Sweet returned to the scene with State's Attorney Conley and Detective Frenzoni from the Vermont Attorney General's office. State's Attorney Conley brought the skulls to Mary Fletcher Hospital in Burlington, where they were photographed. He then traveled alone, armed with a revolver and a blackjack, to see Dr. Alfred B. Rogers, a Boston dentist who specialized in treating irregularities of teeth and was also a graduate of the Angle School. Dr. Rogers concluded that no unusual skill was required to have performed the dental work done, and that the work could have been done in most any dental clinic, including clinics providing services to those of poor circumstances. Extensive work was done to contact dentists throughout New England and further, but a match was never made. Detective Frenzoni turned his attention to persons of interest, beginning first with R.R. Ludding of Buffalo, New York. A guest of the Middlebury Hotel, Ludding had shown great interest in the finding of the skeletons and reportedly followed investigators from Middlebury to Burlington in an automobile with Indiana license plates. Police were asked to keep a lookout for him, but the search was discontinued almost as soon as it started. Instead, information about a stranger who went by the name Irving or Arthur Denton caught Detective Frenzoni's attention. According to Middlebury residents, Denton had showed up in August of 1931, buying high-priced items, including a Ford automobile and a property on Starksboro Road, and paying for them all in cash. He also whitewashed his property's windows, blackened its lights, and warned neighbors to keep away. In February 1932, Denton abruptly left town, ordering the sale of his property, with the money going to the Pacific National Bank in Seattle, Washington. While recalling Denton, the neighbor living closest to the crime scene stated that 1932 was the year a dank odor of decaying flesh came from the woods, but could not be placed. Harold Young was another person of interest. Young came to Burlington in 1929 to operate a store on the corner of Monroe and Champlain Streets, which was part of the Grand Union Tea Company. Believed to be a bootlegger or in the moonshine business not too far from Buffalo, persons who knew him said that Young said it got too hot for him there. His acquaintances said he also owned a .38 caliber Colt. John Deyette, who owned the building where the store was located, said Young was taken aback after receiving a notice that his wife and child, A girl, about 11 years old, planned to join him in Burlington. Soon after their arrival, Dayette told authorities that Young left with his wife and daughter for 3 days and returned without them. Soon after, Young also left the area. Within a year, despite vigorously investigating multiple leads and including the case in several national journals and publications, as well as interviewing hundreds of orthodontists and dentists, the case began to run cold. Then, in January of 1938, Detective Franzoni thought he struck gold. As part of the investigation, Harvard scientists who examined the remains while they were in Boston provided a more detailed report about the victims. Included in the report were the probable ages of the deceased, the gender of the children, and the year of death, all of which convinced Detective Franzoni the victims might be Mrs. Cora Golden and her children, Charles Jr. and Beulah Elizabeth of Milton. Cora disappeared in 1923 with her children when she was 31 years old. At the time, Charles Jr. was 7 and Beulah was 4. If Cora and her children were killed 7 years after they disappeared, the ages and year of death would align with Harvard's estimates. In addition, the disappearance of a Milton farmhand around the same time as the Goldens proved to be related. Detective Franzoni was able to trace Cora, the farmhand, Joseph Carter, and the children as having spent time in Hartford, Connecticut before coming back to Vermont in 1929. After that, however, he could find no trace of them, leading him to believe that the bodies found in May of 1935 were very likely Cora and her children. Then, in April 1938, Detective Franzoni found the daughter living with an adoptive family in Connecticut. One would think that the detective didn't strike gold at all, given that one child was indeed found alive. However, in tracking down Cora and Joseph Carter, Franzoni learned that they had a child together in 1924. More importantly, that child was a boy. The gender, Harvard scientists concluded both children to be. However, recent DNA testing spearheaded by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner also confirmed that both children were boys and related to each other. After decades of still believing Cora and her 2 boys were the likely victims, State Archivist Tanya Marshall recently found archival records that prove otherwise. Cora Golden and Joseph Carter, perhaps taking advantage of Carter's French roots, used the pseudonyms Cora LaFlash and Thomas Sherris in Vermont vital records related to their marriage and the birth of their son, Francis. The 1930 federal census shows the Sherris family residing in New York, and following Elizabeth Cora Sherris' death in 1938, Thomas, Charles, and Francis all returned back to Vermont. The records had given closure to this lead in the case. Further work by Detective Chris Bowdish at the Middlebury Police Department has proven the records to be correct. DNA testing of a living relative of Beulah show the 3 unidentified persons are neither Beulah's mother nor her brothers. Vital census and other archival records are also shedding lights on the persons of interest Detective Franzoni so actively sought. Harold Young was most likely Harold West of Chelsea. In 1929, the local paper in Fulton, New York, reported that West, having been the manager at the Grand Union Tea Company in Burlington, Vermont, was now the manager of Oneida Creamery in Fulton. The 1930 census lists West in Fulton as a retail grocer living with his wife Clara. Looking a little deeper, it's Harold C. West, not Harold Young, who appears in the 1928 Burlington City Directory as the manager of the Grand Union Tea Company. So what's the current status of this 80-year-old cold case? The mother and her 2 sons have finally been laid to rest in a Middlebury cemetery, and their grave reads, 3 souls, known only to God. Will archival records be the key to putting names to these souls? Time will only tell if the 1935 Middlebury cold case will ever be solved. But without witnesses and physical evidence, one's only hope is that it's in the records.
So anyway, I looked and looked and looked and looked, and then I finally came upon this tiny little blurb in a newspaper. The bodies were found in Vermont. I believe you found that they had been shot. Is that right?
Yeah, they had definitely been shot. They had single gunshot wounds. It was thought execution style.
Okay, so we've got, this is in the early 1930s, I believe.
So they were found in 1935. They were originally, one of the articles I found said they were decomposing, but the more I dug into it, I'm pretty convinced that they had been dead for longer than decomposing, if that makes sense.
I saw skeletal, at some point.
Yes.
So, skeletal remains were found. I found a little tiny blurb of an article from 1931 indicating a mom and her 2 children had gone missing.
Right.
And
It just said that they were being sought. They were seeking to speak with them. The police were.
well, it wasn't even that. It was, oh, I know what it said. It said no trace of them had been found, and it indicated that. Now, this is a very important part of this. The article indicated that the mother had left a note that said, "I'm done. I'm going to end it all." So, like, that is one of 2 things happened. Either she really did leave that note and she was going with her children to go end it all, or the husband killed her and he wrote the note to make it look like that happened. That's what, just in my mind. Now, the article, it's not even an article. It's like a little want ad almost. It was out of Nebraska, and it indicated the woman by her husband's name. So Mrs. Husband's name. So I couldn't even find the woman's name. Very disheartening. The description of the children was vague. About 6, about 11 or 13. And I thought to myself, well, that is, that's crazy. We started digging, you and I both did, and we felt like so this trio from Nebraska, who the only report of them being missing is this tiny blurb in a newspaper that doesn't even give the details of these 3, their name, just the name of the husband and father and Mrs. We were able to find some, inkling of connection to Vermont. And we start digging. Now, I did kind of pause that for a second because I was getting really frustrated. But when you start sort of down one of those paths, this was probably, it was a substantial amount of time and effort. And I didn't find another possibility. I didn't find another trio or information about another trio anywhere. Now, are the 3 bodies that were found in Vermont these 3 people from Nebraska? I have no idea. They weren't in Namus. It just so happened that they were reported missing and it came up and I was able to see it. If it weren't for that, I still wouldn't have even found them. So is it the case that others could be like that and not have been printed in the newspaper? Absolutely. Going off of what I found, we've got a trio which the ages sort of match. The information sort of matches, and their bodies are listed as unidentified remains in Namus. So if we point the investigators in that direction and it leads them to solve the case, great. If not, I don't feel like it's a waste, because do you think they've had any leads on that case?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because when you told me about it, the first thing I did was to try and identify the mother. Not the mother in Vermont, but the mother in the article. And I employ a variety of things to do this. And I think this is around the time you sort of looked at this and you were like, does anybody care if we're doing this? Or does anybody give a shit that this happens? And
because I felt like I was putting a lot of time into it and I wasn't sure if it mattered.
Right. So here's the way that I went about it. I took the names and I wanted to see what women in that time were referencing themselves by that name. And I found 3 possibilities. What was interesting about the possibilities is they didn't all line up time-wise. The mother was estimated to have been in her 30s when she was found. I think the specific range was 30 to 35, and the children were the ranges you described. And I just basically looked at that and I said, can I find that person? So I found 3 women going by that name. And what it appeared to me was that 2 of them were potentially related. One of them, I believe, would have been the mother-in-law. It would have been the mother of the husband.
Okay.
And so I found correspondence related to her. And
Right.
I was able to go through. In fact, when you mentioned to me bodies found and then mentioned to me the husband's name, before you even went any further with that, I actually asked you if it was in the city in Vermont, but I was asking based on having looked up, trying to find the husband's partner. And I asked you, the city and time before I even knew what it was. And I was a little early, so I think I was dealing with who's essentially the mother-in-law in this scenario.
Right.
But I believe that she went by her husband's name, and therefore her daughter-in-law had gotten from her husband, or the mother's son, to go by the same name, probably as the second. But she didn't use the second part. And I don't know that they would have necessarily articulated that in the newspaper article, as vague as it was. They didn't even give us the gender of the children. So
Right, but doesn't that vagueness speak to the incident in and of itself?
in a way it does, and that made me dig harder. It didn't make me go away from it. So what I found was an article that I'm going to drop in. I'm going to read it and drop it in here so that people can understand. And that article is very recent. And there's an audio version of the start of it. And then I found a set of investigators who were doing genetic research and had found some other possibilities and ruled them out. And that's the moment that I said to you, yeah, people do give a shit. People do care about this. So
Right.
What I ended up doing with the information you gave me from this scenario was I reached out to a really polite cold case detective who works for the police department where the bodies were found. But, she works there now, and she's like my age, a little younger. So she was not like this happened. Essentially, this happened 85 years ago now.
Right.
And she wasn't alive. She doesn't necessarily have any connections to this case. It's a file on her desk. It's a case that she looks at. And she was very polite. So I just told her in the course of looking up something else.
Which is true.
Someone I work with came across this information. I saw this article, and I shared the article. And I didn't actually send it to her at first. I sent it to someone I do know in Vermont that I've been talking to. I said, "What would you do with this?" And he called. We talked, and his response was, "You should talk to her." So then I talked to her, and it was a very simple email. I just said, "I found this information in Vermont. I found this information in Nebraska. Here's the police department. I would call that police department and see if that's an open missing persons case for them. And if there's any way for you, because you can follow the husband's trail. That's one of the reasons I'm not using his name here. You can follow the husband's trail. He has living descendants. There's DNA to test. So
if the bones are still there.
No, they have the DNA. I'm positive.
Oh, okay.
She acknowledged they had the DNA, and they've actually done some work genealogically to try and determine who these people are, and they've tested it against other possibilities and come up with nothing. It's an interesting story itself.
Right.
So
and it's funny because the only thing so I put the dates in wrong, so it didn't even return anything that was relevant to what I was looking for. But what I found interesting was the three, because there were three found together and it was so long ago, I was like, this is totally solvable. Provable? I don't know, but this is solvable because now 85 years later, you don't look back and have three people gone missing and it remain unsolved. And it's possible the people in Nebraska ended up being accounted for somehow. I did not find any sort of follow-up.
But it is a good lead. It's not a random lead.
No, it was from a newspaper. It was printed in the newspaper.
Right. And there were people in the area at that time with those names. So it's pretty easy to account for them in Vermont as well. I even got an email follow-up to all of that from the person that I, thought might be the lead on it. And they said, thank you. Any lead in this helps. Whereas with the Mojave Tribal Police, okay. And I
right. And so what does that mean? Because, okay, I can put myself in like the investigator's shoes and say, you've got, I don't feel like they've got tips pouring in over 85-year-old cases or even 30-year-old cases. I feel like that kind of response that you got it shows like that there is no initiative to.
Well,
I don't know.
I think it depends on the people though, because the Parks Police, a couple of different Parks Police have had very interesting responses to me, and they'll come back and say, I like what you're doing, and like that's an interesting match. Like at least one of them in the last week or two said, I am into podcasts and true crime stuff. He was very polite about it all when I was attempting to. That was related to some unidentified remains I was just calling about. I mean, he could have blown me off. He didn't have to take my tip. He didn't have to have anything to do with me, but he took the time to respond. And the other people just sort of blew me off. I think that's an example of where you have a disconnect between agencies, and that's the whole purpose of NamUs, supposedly.
Okay, so this is just my impression. I don't get the impression that the people who do the work that is reflected on NamUs, or if they work for NamUs, I don't feel like they sit around looking at the cases in their spare time like I do.
No, they don't. But not the older ones.
And I don't know why. I mean, I honestly like it. At least it's not, it could be something bad. So at least it's something that at the very worst, I'm just wasting time. But, I feel like, I hear a lot of things. I hear people say armchair investigators never solve anything. You know what it's,
Citizen detectives don't know what they're doing.
Right. And so I hear a lot of that stuff, and my thought is, which I assume everybody's thought is, but that's not the case with me. I put a lot of work in, working a case is regardless of whether I can articulate it or not, it's a step-by-step thing, right? And even for, armchair investigators, you either, sometimes armchair investigators end up with cold cases because they literally can't make it go anywhere. I don't know how to say this, and I'm not trying to be offensive, and I hope it doesn't come off that way, but I don't look to other people's speculation to fuel my own speculation. I try to go off of facts, right? So because of that, except for you, I don't really discuss theories and stuff with a lot of people in a true crime community setting. I also don't rely on, typically I don't rely on, that kind of banter and pretend it's fact. Occasionally I'll come across something, it looks interesting. But because of that sort of put down across the board, people just basically saying we're trying to pretend to be something that we're not, it makes me second guess myself. But I don't see the harm in being wrong necessarily. Does that make sense? I'm trying to sort of push through the fact that there are quote investigators, end quote, that, they're real investigators and, we're pretend investigators or whatever. I don't look at it that way. And, I don't know that it hurts my feelings that they say that, but it undermines, the legitimacy in the fact that I spend a lot of time doing very logical research. I'm not just, coming up with things out of nowhere. I don't think. I find sources for them, and, you know, I try to cobble things together. Now, will it ever, you know, come to fruition and something be right? I don't know. Are they ever even going to let us know that? I don't know.
Well, some of these they will. The oldest ones, they definitely will, because they've been very open about it. The newer stuff is a mixed bag of whether or not you're ever going to find out if you did a thing. But I will say this, like, so this is a question that comes up, like, in the course of video stuff. And I knew this was coming, like, the whole time that people were saying, hey, you should probably, like, really record and capture what you're doing. And I said, well, that's what I'm doing with a podcast. And they're like, no, like, this would be more interesting if you showed it video. And like I said, I pitched it as a joke, and it turned into a little bit of reality. But here's the question they asked. They asked me, would you and her, meaning you, would you guys be doing this even if there weren't cameras on or a microphone? And my answer is by the same story.
Yes.
I was already doing it. I've been doing this for years. This is not new. It's not even close to new.
The very first time you sent me a link to what is now NamUs. I'm pretty sure it was called NamUs even then. But even before NamUs, there were other things. Find the missing.
Back then, it was Identify
Network.
Us. It was Identify
Okay.
Us. That's what it was.
And so, yes, we would be doing it. And we've actually done it for a really long time with no microphone running. You and I together have, you know, done this type of thing because we bounce ideas off of each other. And it's really hard. I don't know a whole lot of people personally. And like I said, I don't glean my theories from other people's theories, because I feel like that can get kind of out of control really quick. Because at least I want to have at least, you know, what I think is a factual basis. But yeah, we would totally continue to be doing this. I don't know why I'm so fascinated with it. I don't know. I feel like everybody deserves to not be a missing person. That's what I think. And, you know, it got compounded when we discovered Israel Keys, and, you know, we found out how many missing people might possibly be his victims. And that sort of changed things a little for me, because I don't know that it's going to happen, but I initially was like on a mission to make sure that none of his secrets were kept. Like, I didn't want a single person that he killed to, you know, suffer that fate forever, as far as, like, you know, not people not knowing that he was responsible for their death. I feel like that. And so, you know, that was obviously like a knee-jerk response to it. But it did sort of it started some stuff that went further than our typical, like, case study work, you know?
Right. And that, you know, I discovered around that same time that there was an audience for it that would be interested in some of the things we're doing. Particularly, your method is very different than mine, but, like, they do sync up pretty well. And, like, we were going to be talking about it, like, pretty much whether we recorded it or not. So the whole point of putting it all together was, one, I was in the same boat with you with Keys. I do not like the mythos around Keys, like the mythology, the whole idea that the FBI, like, would let, or not even the FBI, but, like, Anchorage and the U.S. Attorney's Office with the FBI's backing would let him be this, you know, Bigfoot serial killer that nobody ever solves anything on. And I had told you that, like, a lot of things have, like, timing and windows, and I thought ours had passed because this book came out, and then I was like, this book is long. And then there was another podcast that came out, and I was like, all right, this guy's going to do it. He didn't do it. It's not anything against him. He told good stories, but he basically just told the same stories. He did a lot of ground, like, work on it, but it's not groundbreaking. So, and similar to what you just said is, I'm pretty aware now of, like, what it takes for you to be interested in something, but I'm also pretty aware of what your rules are for sourcing and things like that. It's interesting because on my side, I have a different thing. I don't want to go do something that somebody's already done. I don't like, I'm not one of these people that listens to 50 true crime podcasts and is just totally okay with them telling the exact same story about Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't do that. That's not my thing. It's interesting every once in a while. And I also don't like when they come up with one new thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like they tell you one fact that seems different or one speculative theory that seems different. But I do think it's like time in all of this. Like I get fascinated by certain serial killers when I see things that others don't. But when I really get fascinated by something going on, it's when you see something that others don't. And I'm
right,
ask,
because that takes quite a bit of something. Now, just to go along with what you're saying, I hate to interrupt, but sometimes I like it when the story gets told over and over again, as long as like it's switched up enough. Because some people tell it in a way I don't get it, and then other people tell it in a way that might bring light to the exact same facts that were already mentioned. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I'm like that too. I miss things. Like the current age of like social media and stuff, my kid has to explain things to me. I'm not kidding. And not like serial killer stuff.
I'm not
like,
even going there. I hear you, bud.
Stuff will be shared on our little group chat, and I look at it, and I look at my wife, and then I have to go to the kid, and I'm like, all right, it's one of the moments. And they used to get so mad about it. They don't anymore. I just look at whatever they're doing. I'm like, you got to explain it to me because I don't understand it. But
man, didn't that come too fast?
Yeah, it did come too fast. And so one of the killers that I've always been fascinated by, he's been mentioned in the podcast. He's been mentioned in the Israel Keys story. And I find it so fascinating that I think you're starting to look at him, because I knew that if you ever did, I would be able to have a couple of episodes about some things that have been like in the back of my mind. And like, I never had a place to say it like before we started doing this. And this is sort of the cliffhanger for the next episode, by the way. This is the thing at the end that like we don't tell people in this episode. But I want to know, why were you looking for bodies in Vermont in the 50s? And you screwed up and found that other case.
Well, actually, I wasn't looking in Vermont. I was just looking so the parameters I was trying to find were young children in the 50s that were missing.
Okay,
I'm sorry, that were bodies.
Hold on. Before you say that next thing, let me ask you something. What if we found out about kids going missing? Like, from your perspective, we've never talked about this. We texted about it some.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're yanking.
Like, how
out
often do kids not get reported missing?
It's very rare.
And we've run down all sorts of scenarios at this point where we're like, okay, like you mentioned earlier.
Here's the kids going missing. So here's the kind of rundown that my brain has. Children, I feel like a lot of missing children have suffered, perhaps even accidentally, a misfortune, foul play at the hands of one of their parents. A lot of times, it is extraordinarily uncommon for a child to go missing, not having anything to do with the parents, because see, the parents are who would report the child missing, right? But then now, at least, you've got other, well, we're in the pandemic, but, normally a school, even if it's a preschool or, once they get into elementary type school, somebody's going to notice and report the child missing. I'm skeptical as to, from some of our own experiences, like how much do they really notice the child's not there any longer? That's debatable. But, then you've got friends or you've got, relatives. In most cases, if the parents don't report the child missing, they're at least part of why they have disappeared. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Unless they're completely out of the picture, which is like, orphans, children, or.
Right. But so, to the extent a child is, if they have to be reported missing by somebody besides their parents are more than likely involved. That's been demonstrated in the news recently. And there is a very well-known case that I'd seen before, and I'm trying to think now. Did I tell you how did I make the connection to begin with?
Okay, so what you told me was that you were watching In Defense of.
Yes. Oh, okay, yes, that's right. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I was watching In Defense of. Now, it has come to my attention, which means nobody has said this, but I'm observing different things, and I'm not entirely sure how accurate some of the statements made in that show were. But In Defense of is a show that talks about the defense attorneys for notorious criminals sort of talk about what it was like to defend some of their clients. Now, in this particular episode, and I don't think we should give up who we're talking about just yet, but
No.
The attorney for this person made an off-kilter comment that I had never heard with regard to his client or anything surrounding it. And the comment was, the first victim was a little boy in the woods, to that effect. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm going to play the comment in here, but yeah, that's essentially what he said. I'm going to cut the name and play the comment because he basically gave the impression that there was a sex game going on and the kid got killed.
Correct. And so that's why I started looking. I thought it was weird. I had never heard it before. And then, so in looking for that, I accidentally put in 30 instead of 50, and I kind of went down the path of the Vermont trio and found a Nebraska trio that might be them. And then, so, going back to looking for kids in the 50s, there is which I don't necessarily agree with the name, so I don't know that I'm going to use it, but there was a very young child, a little boy.
And I'm going to cut it off there. I'll wrap a little bit of this up with that clip and a little bit more of what Meg's talking about after the show notes. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LabrottieCreations.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
And he was crying, and he was very upset. And that's when he looked at me from the floor with tears in his eyes and said, John, I really want to be a good person, I'm just not. And that's when he told me, and I think the only person he told was that the first person he killed was a young boy when they were playing some kind of sex game in the woods. And so he must have been only 12, 13, or 14. I didn't go into a lot of detail because I didn't need to or want to. He told me in that interview that he killed over 100 people.
There was a very young child, a little boy, that was found in a box on February 25th, 1957. And he was found in Fox Chase part of Philadelphia, which is in Pennsylvania, obviously. But when I saw that, and so he's referenced as the boy in the box. And at this point, he's known as America's unknown child. It's a very famous child's case. That child, that like two possibilities that it could have been, he was ruled out as being like the missing children that fit that scenario. And so and this is a little child. Like, I mean, I don't know how
under 6.
Yeah, and possibly as young as 2 or 3 or whatever. But so it's a little child who is not reported missing now, and he's been confirmed to not be, according to the records. I mean, I didn't do the DNA test, but according to the records, he's not either one of the most logical choices.
Stephen Craig Dammit was last seen at a supermarket in East Meadow, Long Island, New York, on October 31st, 1955. The establishment was a block and a half from his home. He had gone there with his mother and his 7-month-old sister. Stephen's mother left him and his sister outside the supermarket for about 10 minutes while she shopped for bread. When she came out, both children were gone. Stephen's sister was recovered still inside her carriage a few blocks away, but her brother has never been heard from again. In late November 1955, a student at Queens College in New York City wrote 3 letters demanding money from Stephen's parents in exchange for the toddler's safe return. Each letter subsequently asked for a larger amount. First, $3,000, then $10,000, then $14,000. Stephen's parents attempted to comply, but the student turned out to be an opportunist who had nothing to do with Stephen's presumed abduction. It was suggested that Stephen might be America's unknown child, or the boy in the box, a small boy who was found dead inside a cardboard box in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1957. They both were blonde and blue-eyed, and both had the same scars. However, the unidentified boy did not have a healed arm fracture as Stephen had, and Stephen's footprints, taken when he was a baby, did not match the Philadelphia child. In 2003, the police compared the unidentified boy's DNA with DNA from Stephen's sister to make sure, and they conclusively proved that Stephen was not the boy in the box. The child remains unidentified in spite of a major investigative effort that continues even today. Stephen is originally from Iowa. His father was in the Air Force in 1955, and the family was stationed on Long Island. His father left the Air Force a few months after Stephen's abduction, and the family returned to Iowa. His parents divorced in 1957, and both of them later remarried. His father still lives in Iowa and had 2 sons by a second marriage. His mother now lives in Missouri. The case received additional media attention in 2009, when a Michigan man claimed that he was Stephen. But DNA tests ruled out this possibility. There is very little evidence available to indicate Stephen's fate, and the case remains unsolved. Frederick Andrew Holmes was last seen in Grahamsville, New York, at 9:00 a.m. on May 25, 1955. His older siblings were at school, and his mother was working in the garden when he disappeared. Frederick stopped in a cobbler's shed next to his home and spoke to his family's landlord. This was the last known sighting of him. He has never been heard from again, and an extensive search of the area turned up no sign of him. The police investigation initially focused on Frederick's parents and their landlord. Both parents passed polygraph tests and were cleared as suspects. When police searched the landlord's residence, they found numerous stolen items hidden in his garage, and he was jailed. But no one has ever been named as a suspect in Frederick's disappearance. Frederick's mother believes her son was kidnapped and sold. He had long hair at the time of his disappearance, and his sister speculated that someone could have passed him off as a girl to evade detection. Frederick's father died by suicide in 1968, and his mother died in 1979. 5 of his 7 siblings have also died in the years following his disappearance, but 2 of his sisters are still alive and hope that he may be found. His case remains unsolved.
For a number of reasons, I think the cases involving kids are probably the hardest for me. But cases like this, I start to look at them, and I look at the fact that DNA still exists, and I really want to put the DNA into Ancestry and into the other databases and find out, did they have ancestors? Did they have kids? 'Cause these cases are over 60 years old. If we put their DNA in now, we might be able to trace their lives back. How interesting would that be to be able to close missing persons cases the way that we're currently closing, genealogically, cold case homicides, rapes, and other serious crimes?